I'll never forget the day my daughter turned 7. For weeks, she had been talking nonstop about her party. She wanted balloons, cake, music, games, and most importantly, to have all her little friends over to celebrate. My wife and I had been working hard to make it perfect. We decorated the backyard with colorful streamers, rented a small bouncy castle, and set up tables with party favors. It was shaping up to be the kind of day every child dreams of. But in our neighborhood, nothing ever came easy because we had an HOA. If you've ever dealt with one, you already know the kind of headaches they bring. They didn't like anything that wasn't under their complete control. You couldn't paint your front door without approval. Couldn't park your car the wrong way. Couldn't even put up Christmas lights early without risking a fine. So of course, the moment we started planning something as joyful as a children's birthday party, the HOA decided they had to interfere. It started a week before the party when I received a letter in my mailbox. The letter claimed that holding a birthday party with excessive decorations and noise could be considered a violation of community rules. They went on to warn that having too many cars parked along the street could result in fines. My wife rolled her eyes and said, "They just can't stand to see people happy." I agreed. But I refused to let them ruin my daughter's big day. The morning of the party arrived, and the backyard looked magical. Balloons floated in the air, music played softly from the speakers, and my daughter wore a glittery crown with the number 7 on it. She was beaming with excitement, waiting for her friends to arrive. Parents started pulling up. Kids ran to the backyard, and laughter filled the air. For a moment, it felt like nothing could spoil it. But then, I saw them. 3 members of the HOA board walking down the sidewalk with clipboards in hand, wearing the same sour expressions they always carried. I knew instantly what they were up to. They marched straight toward my yard, ignoring the kids and parents, and began pointing at the decorations. One of them, Mrs. Turner, the HOA president, spoke in her usual condescending tone. "This party is not approved," she said sharply. "You can't have that bounce house without clearance. The balloons tied to the fence are a safety hazard. And look at all these cars. This is unacceptable. You need to shut this down immediately or we'll start issuing fines." I stood there, stunned. Kids were laughing, parents were chatting. The cake was ready, and here were these people trying to kill the joy out of pure spite. I calmly told her, "It's my daughter's birthday, and I'm not shutting anything down. We're not doing anything illegal," but she wasn't having it. Another board member chimed in, saying they would call the authorities if I didn't comply. At first, I thought they meant the police. I imagined squad cars pulling up in front of my house, confusing parents and frightening kids. My wife looked at me with panic in her eyes, whispering, "They're not going to ruin this, are they?" I put my hand on her shoulder and promised, "No, I'll handle it." The HOA president pulled out her phone and made a call right there in my driveway. She stepped aside, lowering her voice. But I heard enough to know she was reporting a fire code violation and unsafe conditions because of the bounce house and decorations. She was trying to make it sound like we were endangering children just for having fun. I felt my blood boil, but I decided to let it play out. If they wanted to escalate things, fine. I knew I hadn't broken any laws. A few parents overheard the exchange and shook their heads in disbelief. One dad muttered, "These people are unbelievable." Another mom whispered, "Don't let them scare you." The kids are having the time of their lives. Minutes later, sirens echoed in the distance. The HOA members straightened up proudly as if their master plan was about to succeed. They probably imagined police cars rolling up to shut me down. But when the red truck turned the corner, it wasn't the police. It was the fire department. A massive fire engine pulled up in front of my house, lights flashing. The kids ran to the fence, pointing excitedly, thinking it was part of the party. My daughter's eyes lit up, shouting, "Daddy, look!" Firefighters came to my birthday. Meanwhile, the HOA president looked smug, like she had one. She marched up to the firefighters the moment they stepped out, waving her clipboard. "Over here," she called. "This man is holding an unsafe gathering. There's a bounce house, electrical hazards, and parked cars blocking the road. You need to shut this down immediately." The lead firefighter gave her a puzzled look, then turned to me. "Sir, we got a call about a fire code violation. Mind if we take a look?" "Of course," I said, leading them into the backyard. Parents stood quietly, kids still bouncing in the castle, unaware of the tension. The firefighters walked around, checked the cords, looked at the decorations, and inspected the setup. One of them even smiled at my daughter and wished her a happy birthday. After a few minutes, the firefighter came back to me and said, "Everything looks fine here. You're not violating any fire codes." Whoever called this and wasted our time, I looked over at the HOA members. Their faces dropped instantly. The firefighter wasn't finished, though. He added, "In fact, while we were driving in, we noticed something at the HOA office building. Your propane tank for the outdoor grill isn't secured properly, and that's a real safety violation. We'll be addressing that today." The color drained from the HOA president's face. Parents around me started chuckling quietly, and even a few clapped. The firefighters ignored the HOA's protests, assuring me that the party could continue without issue. Then, to make things even better, one firefighter asked, "Mind if we let the kids explore the truck before we go? It'll make their day." The backyard erupted in cheers. The HOA members had no choice but to slink away while my daughter and her friends got to climb inside a fire truck, honk the horn, and take pictures with real firefighters. What the HOA tried to use to ruin her party ended up becoming the highlight of the entire day. That was the moment I realized. Sometimes the best way to deal with people like the HOA isn't to fight them directly. It's to let their own bitterness backfire on them. And trust me, this was just the beginning. After the fire truck pulled away and the last firefighter waved goodbye to the kids, the party roared back to life. The children couldn't stop talking about how they got to climb inside the truck, ring the bell, and even sit in the driver's seat. My daughter kept hugging me, saying, "Daddy, this is the best birthday ever." Parents were smiling, snapping photos, and eating cake. From every angle, it looked like the party had been a massive success. But of course, the HOA wasn't done with me. They never stopped after one defeat, they doubled down. The HOA president, Mrs. Turner, and her two sidekicks stormed off earlier. Embarrassed, but I noticed the way she whispered something angrily to one of them before leaving. I knew she'd be back with another angle. That's just how she was. Sure enough, 2 days later, a letter arrived in my mailbox. This time, it was an official notice of violation from the HOA. They accused me of holding an unauthorized community event on private property, which they claimed created a disturbance. The letter stated that I owed $500 in fines for unapproved structures, referring to the rented bounce house, and another $200 for excessive noise. I almost laughed out loud when I read it. 7-year-olds giggling and bouncing in the backyard was apparently excessive noise in their eyes. The bounce house had been taken down the same day and wasn't a permanent structure. It was absurd. But more than that, I knew they were grasping at straws. They had lost face in front of the entire neighborhood when the firefighters sided with me. And now they were trying to save their pride by punishing me through paperwork. I showed the letter to my wife, and she rolled her eyes. "This is harassment," she said. "They're just mad they got embarrassed. You can't let this slide." She was right. Normally, I might have just paid a small fine to avoid the headache, but this wasn't about money anymore. This was about standing up to people who thought they could bully us into submission. I picked up my phone and called one of the parents who had been at the party, a guy named Tom who happened to be a lawyer. I explained the situation and he laughed. They're really pushing their luck. "You know, they can't just make up violations, right?" he said. I admitted I wasn't sure what rules they could enforce, but Tom offered to help me draft a response. "If they want to play this game, we'll play it better. Let's remind them of what actual law looks like." So, with Tom's help, I wrote a letter back. I cited the HOA's own bylaws, pointing out that private family gatherings were not restricted, and temporary rentals like bounce houses didn't qualify as unapproved structures. I also reminded them that their attempt to involve the fire department had backfired, and that filing false safety reports could be considered harassment and abuse of authority. Finally, I included a line that made me smile as I typed it. "Any further attempts to interfere with private family celebrations will be considered targeted harassment, and I will not hesitate to pursue legal action." We mailed the letter, and for a week, things were quiet. I started to think maybe they'd finally realized they'd lost. But that hope didn't last long. At the next HOA meeting, which I attended out of pure curiosity, Mrs. Turner made me the center of discussion. She stood at the front of the room, clutching her clipboard like a weapon, and declared, "We cannot allow homeowners to defy community standards. If one person gets away with holding disruptive events, what's to stop others from doing the same? We'll have chaos." Several neighbors pushed back immediately. One mom, who had been at the party with her kids, stood up and said, "Disruptive? It was a children's birthday party. The only disruption came from you showing up with threats and clipboards." People around the room nodded in agreement. Another dad chimed in. "And let's not forget, you called the fire department, wasting their time. They checked everything and said it was perfectly safe. Maybe the HOA should focus on real issues instead of ruining kids' birthdays." The room grew tense. For the first time, Mrs. Turner was visibly shaken. She wasn't used to people siding against her. Normally, she could bully her way through meetings without resistance. But this time, the parents weren't letting it slide. I didn't even need to say much. The community was speaking up for me. Still, the board tried to vote on whether to uphold my fine. When they raised their hands, it was 3 in favor, all board members, and 7 against, the homeowners who had shown up. My fine was dismissed on the spot. Mrs. Turner's face turned red, and she muttered something about appealing the decision, but the damage was already done. The community had seen her for what she was, a bully who hated joy. And now she wasn't just up against me, she was up against all the parents who had witnessed her antics firsthand. As I left the meeting, a neighbor patted me on the back and said, "Good job standing up to them." Someone needed to. That's when it clicked. This wasn't just about a birthday party anymore. This was about sending a message to the HOA. We weren't going to let them control every corner of our lives. And little did Mrs. Turner know, her battle against me had only just begun. Because the more she pushed, the more determined I became to push back. After the HOA meeting where the fines were voted down, I thought maybe things would calm down. Maybe Mrs. Turner would finally realize she had pushed too far and embarrassed herself enough. But if you've ever dealt with an HOA president who thrives on control, you already know what happened next. She didn't back down, she doubled down a week later. I was enjoying a Saturday morning coffee on the porch when I noticed her walking slowly past my house with her clipboard in hand. She stopped at the edge of my yard, looked around like she was surveying enemy territory, and scribbled something down. My stomach sank. She wasn't letting this go. Later that day, I received yet another notice taped to my door. This time, the violation claimed my lawn decorations from the party balloons and banners that had long since been taken down were a violation of unsightly displays. I actually laughed when I read it. My yard was spotless, cleaner than it had been in months, and she was trying to fine me for decorations that weren't even there anymore. It was clear she was making things up as she went along, but this time, something different happened. Neighbors started noticing her behavior. A mom down the street told me she saw Mrs. Turner snapping photos of my house in the middle of the night with her phone flashlight. Another family said she had approached them, asking whether they felt disturbed by the party and trying to convince them to file complaints against me. Nobody wanted to get involved in her crusade, and most of them were starting to get fed up. One neighbor, an older gentleman named Frank, who had lived in the community for 20 years, pulled me aside. "Son," he said, "I've seen a lot of nonsense from this HOA, but this takes the cake. She's targeting you because you embarrassed her. And you're not the first one she's done this to. But you might be the one who finally stops her." Frank told me that years ago. She had tried to ban his American flag from hanging outside his porch because it clashed with the uniform appearance of the neighborhood. He fought back and won. But ever since then, she had made life miserable for him in little ways: letters, inspections, accusations. She was a pattern bully, and I was just her latest target. I realized then that this wasn't just about my family anymore. It wasn't even just about the birthday party. It was about the way she used her role to make everyone feel powerless. And suddenly, I had an idea. Instead of playing defense and waiting for her next move, I decided to go on the offensive. I began documenting everything. Every letter she sent. Every supposed violation. Every neighbor who came to me with a story. I compiled a folder of evidence. And with Tom's help, the lawyer parent who had backed me before we started drafting a formal complaint. Not just to the HOA board, but also to the city's code enforcement office. But here's the twist. While I was gathering evidence, Mrs. Turner made a fatal mistake. One afternoon, she showed up at my front door while I was working in the garage. Without knocking, she marched right onto my property, ranting about how I was creating a hostile environment for the neighborhood. Children by encouraging disorder. The irony was laughable. I calmly asked her to leave my property, and when she refused, I pulled out my phone and started recording. The moment she saw the red recording light, her face turned pale. She stammered something about just doing her duty and stormed off. But that video was gold. It showed her trespassing, harassing me, and making baseless claims, all in her own words. When I showed the video to a couple of neighbors, they were furious. Not at me, at her. One by one, people started coming forward with their own stories. She had yelled at a teenager for playing basketball in his driveway. She had threatened to fine a couple for having too many flowers in their garden because it distracted from the uniform landscaping. She had even harassed an elderly woman for putting out a bird feeder, saying it attracted undesirable wildlife. I realized I wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. The whole neighborhood was waking up to her abuse of power. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. People who hadn't attended in years showed up, and nearly all of them had something to say. I brought my folder of evidence and played the video of her trespassing for everyone to see. Gasps went through the room, and for the first time, Mrs. Turner looked like she was losing her grip. She tried to defend herself, saying I had provoked her and that I was out to undermine the HOA, but nobody was buying it anymore. One by one, my neighbors spoke up. They defended me, told their own stories, and demanded accountability. That night, a board agreed to hold a formal vote of no confidence in her leadership. And while it wasn't finalized yet, the writing was on the wall. Walking out of that meeting, my wife turned to me and said, "You didn't just stand up for us. You stood up for everyone here," and she was right. But I knew Mrs. Turner wouldn't go quietly. She was too stubborn, too prideful. This war wasn't over, yet was only escalating. After that heated HOA meeting, where my video and evidence turned the tide against Mrs. Turner, I thought maybe, just maybe, things were finally going to change. The neighborhood had rallied. People who had been silent for years suddenly found their voices. The board had voted to review her conduct, and it felt like justice was finally in motion. But if there's one thing I've learned, It's that people like Mrs. Turner don't just fade quietly into the background. They claw, they scratch, and they burn every bridge on their way out. And true to form, she wasn't about to let go of her control without one last desperate act. It started small. Random cars began parking suspiciously close to my driveway at odd hours. Flyers with bold letters saying unruly neighbors disrupting our community mysteriously appeared in mailboxes, with my address listed as the source of chaos. It was laughable, but also frustrating. I knew exactly who was behind it. Then came the kicker. One Saturday morning, just a couple of weeks after the birthday party debacle, my daughter asked if she could invite some friends over for a small get-together. Nothing huge, nothing fancy. Just a backyard playdate with pizza, games, and music. We said yes, of course. After the nightmare we'd just gone through, I wasn't about to let the HOA dictate whether my kid could have fun with her friends. But as soon as the first few kids arrived and we set up a speaker to play some light background music, I noticed Mrs. Turner standing across the street, arms crossed, glaring like a hawk. My wife whispered, "Here we go again." Sure enough. About 20 minutes later, a city code enforcement officer pulled up in a white SUV. He walked into the yard, clearly uncomfortable, and said, "I received a complaint about a noise violation and unpermitted gathering." I almost laughed. "Officer, it's a children's playdate. We've got 6 kids, a pizza box, and a Bluetooth speaker playing Disney songs. Do you think that qualifies as a violation?" The officer glanced around, clearly realizing how ridiculous the situation was. He shook his head. "No, sir, it doesn't. I just had to respond since the call came in." He left without issuing a warning. But I could see Mrs. Turner fuming from across the street, her face red with anger. That's when I realized she wasn't just targeting me anymore. She was escalating into harassment, using city resources to try to intimidate us. So I decided to fight smarter. I called the city directly and filed a harassment report, showing them the repeated false complaints. They advised me to keep documenting everything and assured me that if it continued, it could be legal consequences for the one filing false reports. That was the first real crack in her armor. But the real showdown came a week later. The board had scheduled a special meeting to decide Mrs. Turner's future as president. The community turnout was massive, standing room only again. And this time, people were angry. Not just annoyed, not just tired, angry. One by one, neighbors stood up and told their stories. Frank spoke about the flag incident from years ago. The mom down the street described Mrs. Turner harassing her son for skateboarding on the sidewalk. An elderly woman recounted how Mrs. Turner had threatened to fine her over a bird feeder. By the time it was my turn to speak, the room was electric. I stood up, looked around, and said, "This isn't just about my daughter's birthday party anymore. This is about the fact that we've all been living under fear of letters, fines, harassment, and humiliation. That ends tonight." When I finished, the room erupted in applause. Mrs. Turner tried to speak, but her words were drowned out by boos. The board didn't hesitate. They held the vote right then and there. By a landslide, Mrs. Turner was removed as president. The relief in the room was palpable. You could almost feel the weight lifting off everyone's shoulders. But here's the twist. The story didn't end there. Because while Mrs. Turner was stripped of her title, she wasn't ready to walk away quietly. And what she did next? Well, it involved the fire department, a final attempt to cling to her power, and the entire neighborhood watching her downfall play out in real time. After Mrs. Turner was voted out as HOA president, the entire neighborhood thought we could finally breathe again. But if you've ever dealt with someone who thrives on control, you know they don't just walk away quietly. And Mrs. Turner, she had one last storm in her before the end. It happened just a few days after the board removed her. My daughter's actual rescheduled birthday party was finally happening. We kept it simple, but fun: streamers, balloons, a rented bounce house, music, and of course, the kids she loved having around. Parents came, too, turning it into a cheerful block gathering. The whole neighborhood seemed lighter, like people were finally free to enjoy themselves again. And then, like clockwork, Mrs. Turner appeared. She was standing across the street, arms stiff at her side, watching like she couldn't stand the sight of people being happy without her permission. I ignored her, determined not to let her ruin another day for my daughter. About 30 minutes in, though, we heard sirens. A fire truck pulled into the street, followed by a smaller fire department vehicle. Everyone paused, kids stopped bouncing. Adults looked confused. The firefighters climbed out and walked toward me. "Double quotes, sir," one of them said. "We received a report of an unsafe gathering, possible fire hazard due to decorations, and an obstructed emergency route." I blinked. "What?" "It's a birthday party. We've got balloons, a bounce house, and tables of food." "That's it." The firefighter nodded. "Yeah, we figured as much. But we're required to check when someone calls it in." The parents started murmuring, and kids were whispering nervously. Then one of the firefighters glanced around, spotted Mrs. Turner standing across the street with her phone in hand, and muttered under his breath. Figures the lead firefighter raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to be clear. There is no safety issue here. This is a perfectly safe, perfectly normal party. Whoever called this and wasted our time and your tax dollars." Then, to my complete surprise, he added, "And we'll be filing a report for false claims." This kind of misuse of emergency services is taken seriously. The crowd erupted not in panic, but in laughter and applause. Parents clapped, kids cheered, and even the firefighters cracked smiles. It was the exact opposite of what Mrs. Turner wanted. Instead of shutting us down, she had given us a story to laugh about for years to come. Mrs. Turner, red-faced and trembling with rage, turned on her heel and stormed back into her house. That was the last time she ever tried to interfere with my family again. A few weeks later, she quietly put her house up for sale and left the neighborhood altogether. And as for us, my daughter had the best birthday party ever. Not because of the bounce house or the cake, but because our entire community came together to celebrate not just her birthday, but the end of an era of fear. So, what's the takeaway from all this? Here's what I learned. People like Mrs. Turner thrive on intimidation. But when a community stands together, no single person can hold that kind of power forever. The HOA that once felt like a prison is now actually run by neighbors who care about the people living there. And my daughter, she learned a lesson. 2, that sometimes the best way to beat a bully is simply to let them expose themselves. Thanks for listening to this story. If you've ever had to deal with an overreaching HOA or a neighbor who thought they could control everyone, I hope this story gave you a little hope and maybe a laugh. Because in the end, the good guys don't just win, they throw the best parties.